Hello, climbers. Sorry, George and I were just having our lunch. I hope you've all had a good week since our last video. George, we're going to finish our lunch later. For now, we're going to hear a story about a meal that Jesus had with his friends, called his disciples. To help us understand the story properly, we need to rewind to over 1,000 years before it happened. God's people, the Israelites, were slaves in Egypt. They were treated very, very badly, and life was pretty horrible. Their leader Moses kept going to the king of Egypt, called Pharaoh, begging him to let the Israelites go. But Pharaoh liked having slaves, so he wouldn't let them go. God sent all kinds of plagues, which are like diseases, on the Egyptians to try and convince Pharaoh to let them go. But Pharaoh would not. So God had to take more serious action. God gave his people some very specific instructions for a meal they were to have one night. They had to take a 1-year-old lamb, they had to kill it, cook it, and eat it all up. But before they cooked the lamb, they had to take some of its blood and put it on their front doors. God was going to bring the worst disaster yet on the Egyptians so that they would finally let the Israelites go. That night, God passed through Egypt, and the oldest child of every family, of human families and animal families, died. It was awful. But the houses that had the blood on the door were safe. The blood was a sign that God's people lived there, and it showed that a lamb had already died, and God accepted that as a sacrifice. A person in that house didn't have to die because the lamb had already died in their place. The Israelites were saved! God told the people to celebrate this meal every year to remember how he had rescued them. This meal was called the Passover because it celebrated how the Israelites had been saved from death when God passed over their house because he saw that a lamb had died in their place. Now, back to Jesus having dinner with his friends. Yep, you guessed it. This meal they're having is the Passover. All these years later, God's people are still remembering and celebrating that he rescued them from Egypt. That's what Jesus and his disciples are doing here. As they were about to eat, Jesus said, "I have desperately wanted to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." What's Jesus saying? Well, the next thing Jesus did was he took the bread and he broke it and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then Jesus took the wine and he said, "This is my blood poured out for you." Jesus is saying that his body is going to be broken and his blood poured out for us. Jesus is going to die. He is going to be like the Passover lamb. Just like the Israelites needed rescuing from slavery, we need rescuing from all the wrong things that we think and say and do, which separate us from God. And just like the Israelites were saved because the Lamb had died in their place, we can be saved because Jesus has died in our place as a sacrifice for us. By breaking the bread and pouring the wine, Jesus is telling his disciples that he is going to the cross to be a sacrifice for us, so that we can be forgiven and can be friends with God again.